today. It's a talk on Madras, the historical Fin city. Gives me great pleasure to extend a welcome to a most sought after historian, especially today on Madras Day as celebrations are happening everywhere in this period. Sriram, thank you for consenting to be part of our celebrations.
Thanks, Srivat. Thank you.
I'm glad to inform everyone that Sriram has been engaged with our chamber for many years. He knows the history of the chamber better than most of us. And he made a very interesting 175th anniversary book called Championing Enterprise in 2011, which chronicles the history of our chamber over all these years. And he's also made a number of excellent presentations on Madras and the Madras Chamber in the 2017 Madras Day celebrations. Uh, I'd also like to thank our past president, TTS, who was instrumental in publishing the book. Uh, the chamber doesn't need any elaborate introduction to the participants today, but we were established in 1836 and we are in our 184th year. Uh, we're about half the age of the city itself. The city was founded on 22nd August 1639. At the same time, as industry and commerce started to thrive, is about the time that we got into the act as a chamber. And our latest initiative is actually towards making Chennai the next financial hub. We have a core team who's been working on this project and working with experts and interacting with the government. And we have also been asked to prepare a draft fintech policy for the government of Tamil Nadu. So, 22nd August is our birthday as a city. 22nd August 1639 is when we started, and it's something that I think more than anything tells us about the long history and heritage of our city. That it has been there for almost 400 years. We commemorate Madras Day every year. There's an event which is organized around this, and as we are working towards Chennai as the next fintech hub, we wanted to hear from Sriram historically how it's been, and Sriram's talk would also go forward to prove that we are right in our thinking of Chennai having a certain historical uh, precedence that gives us the right to dream of a Fin city and Chennai being a Fin city. So with this, I'd like to also briefly introduce Sriram. Sriram doesn't require any introduction for many of us in the city, but he is, to start off with, he's a businessman, a columnist, a music historian, and a heritage activist who is well known for his books about the history of the city, Carnatic music, and theatre in the city. Sriram studied at the College of Engineering in Delhi and did his MBA from there. And he works as the Chief Operating Officer at Broadgate Technical Services, a software company in Chennai, and has also manages his family firm of industrial hydraulics. He started writing about the history of Chennai from the mid 90s, and in total, he has written over 10 books and has been a regular columnist for Hindu, for whom he pens a column titled Hidden Histories. He was also one of the founders and principal organizers of Madras Day celebrations in the city and is an intact coordinator for the Chennai region and an editor of Madras Musings newspaper. We're proud, as I mentioned, we're also proud to have him author our coffee table book, championing enterprise during our 175th year celebrations. So welcome, Sriram, and
Thank you.
look forward to hearing your talk.
Thanks a lot. I just need a confirmation that you can see my the opening slide, Madras as a
Yes,
historical
Yes,
city.
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
yes,
we can
Sridhar.
see it.
Yeah, we can see it.
So, good evening, everybody. This is a story take you through how the city grew as a center for financial services almost from and I must actually thank the chamber for having given me this topic to speak on. I never realized, at least working on this presentation, about the number of ideas that really came out from Chennai or Madras as a city as far as financial services were concerned. Uh, of course, I think it is kind of a quirk of history that other centers in this country took on those ideas and made them much bigger. But there is no denying the fact that the ideas really came from here. And so there appears to be something to do with the Chennai soil that gave a lot of fertile imagination when it came to finance. Much of it good, some of it not very good. But then I suppose all that makes for what is really history, especially in the financial sector. So if you look at the city itself, we say that the colonial city of Madras began on in August 1639. But there are several parts of the city that go back much earlier. So Tiruvallikeni, Tiruvattriyur, Tirunirmalai, and so on. These are all centers that probably existed from the 5th or centuries. And we find that there is a very healthy culture of financial activity that goes on in all these historic locations, even much before the British came. Conjecture that when the British there was probably a reasonable amount of activity in all these villages that would eventually become part of Madras city. And because there was a certain amount of financial activity, it would appear that the British themselves began to lean on those financial services that were available here. And that is how they actually progressed over a period of time. So it is very unlikely that they would have brought their principles of bookkeeping and accounting here and thrust it on the locals, because in the initial years they were just not powerful enough to do it. They were buffeted about by several local powers, and it was only a good 100 years after they settled here that they really became powers to reckon with, and their writ began to run large. So it's very likely that they depended on whatever was happening. So it's very apt to really start with seeing what do we really get to see about old financial practices in this region, which would eventually become the Chennai city that we know of today. So if you look at the Tyagaraja Swami temple in Tiruvattriyur, which, which, if legend is to be believed, has existed since time immemorial, but has certainly had inscriptions going back to the time of the Pallavas, so we are 6th, 7th, and the 8th centuries. So you have this, from this, we are able to see that there was a thriving business community here, which was in practice of accepting money being paid as deposit, investing it in some other activity, earning interest on that, and paying out interest to the original investor who had placed the money with the business service. So this essential service was really being done by the Chettiar community over here. And this temple itself is very sacred to the Chettiars in particular, and they have historically endowed it with a considerable amount of their wealth. And all around this particular village, even today, you have Chettiar mutts, Chettiar rest houses, which indicates how important it was for them. In these temples, you have these inscriptions which keep talking about how, so and so came and endowed the temple with money so that a lamp would be kept perpetuity in their memory in this particular in the shrine. So how does this work at a very simple level? The temple does not keep the principal. What does it do with that money? That money is essentially handed over to a chettiar, and he invests it in some activity and pays an interest to the temple. And it is from the income, that interest that is earned, that the lamp was actually lit. And that is how the lamp was being kept. It is not the if the principal was being used for it, the principal would have vanished a long while ago. So that money was actually being invested. It was being invested with a shepherd or a cowherd who would be allowed to buy a certain set of cows and a bull, and a certain number of cows would be impregnated, and so when they deliver, they would milk. Then the other cows would be, impregnated. So the milk from these cows would come to the would be sold. That money would then be handed over to the temple, from which the lamp would be kept burning. So it was a very efficient system, and it indicates how there was a very sensitive and a very evolved set of financial practices that was going on. Certainly, finance also depends a lot on trust. And therefore, you do see that they believed that the Chettiars would deliver on the investment and it was sacred to them. And so they were very comfortable placing the money with the Chettiars. So in ancient temples, this appears to have been the practice. Jumping straight to the time of the British, we find that the British, or with the Portuguese, see, the Portuguese were here earlier. They were in San Tome. And then the Dutch came, and the Dutch were in a place called Pulicat, which is just to the north of the city. The British right in the middle. And the British began to learn from the Dutch on how to conduct their business. In fact, initially, if history had played itself differently, the British would not have stood a chance. When they came here, the Dutch were all powerful and they had a set of 9 factories starting from Pulicat and going all the way up to Kanyakumari. When I say factory, these were all storehouses where cloth was being stored and then being exported. The British learned from the Dutch and they realized that because they did not know the local language, they had to depend on a set of translators. The Dutch used those interpreters, and these were men who were known as Dwi, knew 2 languages. Essentially, Portuguese, which was the language, the internationally accepted language at that time for business, and they knew Telugu or Tamil, which was the local language. So these Dvibhashis over a period of time became corrupted to Dubash. The Dvibhashi was in a great position of strength because neither of the the language of the other party. Whatever the Dvibashi said was the writ that ran large. So if they were transacting for a bale of cloth, for instance, and the weaver said that it was 250 rupees, I'm just giving a figure, 250 was a mammoth sum. But if they would say 250 rupees, the Dubash would turn around and say it would cost the Englishman 750 rupees to buy the bale. And the Englishman would, I don't think I can afford 750, tell him to make it 600. He would turn around and tell the weaver the Dore wants it for 150. And the difference was largely pocket bush. And you find that much of what is Georgetown today was populated with some of the most powerful Dubashas of their time. And the streets of town, the streets of Mylapore, several streets in Triplicane, they are all named after the Dubashas of the 17th century, which is when the English were 17th and 18th century, which is when the English were finding their feet. Certainly, one Dubash whom we all know of is Pachepa Mudaliar, whose photograph I have put up, whose portrait I have put up over here, after whom the Pachepa's Trust is named. And as we all know, he died childless, and all his wealth was bequeathed to temple services. But because the will itself was contested for almost 50 years after his death, it earned so much of interest that his estate earned so much of interest that that money was sufficient to take care of services, and the rest of the money was plowed by the government into education, which is how the Pachepa's Trust came to be formed, and then the Pachepa's colleges and all came to be in existence. But the very interesting thing is when you read Pachepa Mudaliar's biography, as written by a junior contemporary of his, you find that financial services was one of the most important part of a Dubash's life. The Dubash was not just into interpreting and trying to manage conversations between one and the other. He was not like, where a prime minister goes to meet the president of another country and then you have somebody in the middle who is turning from side to side and interpreting what the other. It's not that. The Dubash had a very active role in managing the finances of the East India Company itself, because in those days, the gold and the silver had to come from England to fund the purchases of cloth. Very often the ships never came because they were either caught by pirates, or there was a storm in the high seas, or there was a war with the French at that point of time. The ship sank carrying all the gold and silver. For months on end, no money really came. And during that time, it was the Dubashes who got together and funded the East India Company's purchases of cloth and kept the entire wheels of motion, wheels of industry moving with their liquidity. So they were actually borrowing money from the market, lending it to the East India Company, making money on the arbitrage, on the interest that was accumulating to them, where they were, taking forward what we would today call forward positions, in the sense that they would be accumulating the cloth anticipating that this would be the price at this particular would come and the English would be needing it at that time. So they were very, very intelligent men. And if you read the diaries of Ananda Rangapillai, the French Dubash in Pondicherry, you find that Duplex, the governor, depended so heavily on Ananda Rangapillai for practically every transaction. So any cloth that came, it was Ananda Rangapillai who would have to evaluate it. If there was a ruler who had to be placated with a bribe, it was Ananda Rangapillai who placed the bribe in the hands of the ruler. Duplex kept his hands clean, and later on, Duplex would refund the Dubash for the money. Maintains a set of accounts where this is the money that I give this particular date because the Dore has told me to give it. Doresani Ammal, the Dore's wife, has asked me to pay this money to so and so. And I'm sure he was maintaining that diary essentially as proof of the money that he was spending so that when the reconciliation happened, he would be able to furnish accounts and say that this is what you told me on this day, and this is why I was placing this money, I was paying this money. So Dubashis were very actively into lending. And as early as 1670s, we find several Dubashis of Madras get together and they form what is called a joint stock company. So it is perhaps the earliest instance of a corporate body being formed by Indians for carrying on trade in a commodity that was going to be exported. So you had cloth that was being purchased locally, and they were then giving it to the East India Company, forming a joint stock company. So this was as early as the 1670s in the city. The English, of course, were carrying on their trade, and this is a photograph of the Fort Museum in Fort St. In the time of the East India Company, certainly up to 1799 or so, when the business interests left Fort St. George and settled down in what is today Rajaji Salai or First Line Beach, exchange building. This is where the commodity exchange existed for the British merchants who lived in Fort St. George. If you go up to this building and if you peer through the windows, you will find that there is a of the sea, the Bay of Bengal. And up to 1850 or so, up to 1800 or so, the ships would come and park themselves 2 miles in the sea exactly opposite this exchange building. So from here, they would have an idea as to which ship was coming. And from the ship, messages would be sent down by means of rafts, and that would be carried here. Letters would go back to the ship. And based upon what value of bullion was being brought, the value of the commodities would keep fluctuating in this building. So this was perhaps the first modern commodities exchange in the whole country, this particular building. And down below, in the ground floor of this building, you had the first bank, the modern bank. It was called the Madras Bank. And because many ships sank, ships didn't come, and when they came, sometimes, they came minus the bullion because on the way, the money. So you needed a tavern as well to keep your spirits going because you all the time you never knew what shocks would hit your system. So they had a bar over here. It was a very popular bar, and this is where you had wine, port, and Madeira and things like that. And the Madeira would be brought in a casket that was known as peeps. It was a barrel, and the Madeira came from Portugal, and it was kept. The barrels were known as peeps, which is why anybody who is fat is even today in Tamil known as a pipa, or any rounded vessel is called a pipa. It's a word that has come directly from the usage of Madeira in this particular building and later on in the city as well. So this Portuguese word comes in from there, and then it enters our jargon, and we are still using it so many years after the British have vanished. So from it's around this time in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the British realized that to run scams is a very healthy way of making profit in Madras city. So you didn't need to be entirely honest in order. So you didn't need to deal in cloth, and you didn't have to count and see whether you were making a genuine profit. And in any case, the profit all went to the East India Company. You didn't make it. The salary of these merchants was very low. So all of them indulged in what was known as private trade. They bought and sold commodities privately, very often using their relatives, whom they brought in from England to stay over here. And they were, in essence, the beginning of what is called the Benami transaction, because many of them were actually trading on behalf of East India Company servants, and they were feathering their nests in this process. At this time, the British in Madras realized that one of the biggest opportunities is to lend money to the Nawab of Arcot. So this trend starts sometime in the 1780s and has a field day till the early 1800s. So for around 20 years or so, everybody formed what was called an agency house. And the agency house was basically a multi-level financial company where everybody's money was collected and loaned to the Nawab at enormous rates of interest. The Nawab had a very, very profligate lifestyle. He needed the money, and he rarely ever kept any account of what money he was borrowing from whom. So the Nawab's loans began to balloon, and everybody was carrying a bond that the Nawab had signed saying that he had borrowed money from them. And there were several forgeries as well in these bonds. So it was not as though all of them were honest. And some of the people who lent money to the Nawab, they are hallowed names today. For instance, the upper photograph is a portrait is of Thomas Parry, who founded Parry and Company. And the lower portrait is that of John Binney, who founded Binney and Company. These were all people who loaned money to the Nawab of Arcot. The balloon kept, expanding, and whenever they needed money, they would go to the Nawab, give them a village or would give them some locality, and then they would become rent farmers for that locality. They would earn money out of that. The principal was not going to ever come back, but they were earning money on the interest. People in England were also getting interested in this whole thing, that there was money to be made in a far off city if you had the right financial arrangements. So one of the parliamentarians, Edmund Burke, he became very interested and he wanted to invest in the Nawab's debts. He was rebuffed, saying that this is meant only for local people and we are not interested in you. So he became a saint, he became a whistleblower, he raised questions in parliament, and there was a committee of investigation. After that, the Nawab's bubble sank, and there was a commission of inquiry, and then there was a commission that was ordered to sit on the repatriation or the liquidation of the Nawab's debts, which went on for a very long time. Several people went insolvent in the process. And at the end of it, the Nawab, poor man, lost his kingdom as well. The British had to take it over because of the loans which had reached such a huge value. And Parry and Binney went on to form companies of their own and back after that. So the beginning is very interesting that there was a massive scam in that period, a financial scandal, lending money at rates of interest. Then, of course, the Parry Empire, Binney Empire, and all grew up, and then they all become. This is a view of the old Parry's building before the present multi-storied building came up on Parry's corner. Now, this was all the way the English were managing their finances. What was happening to the Indians? Where were they going? Sure, they, of course, had no approaching an East India Company servant to loan them money. The very interesting concept of nidhis begins in Madras city. It is the modern, I would say that nidhis probably existed in all the historic towns of South India, probably in Madurai, Trichy, and all that, long before it made its appearance in Madras. But it would appear that the Indian citizens of this city, were initially depending upon money lenders, which is why you found a lot of Indian money lenders settling down in Georgetown in an area that came to be known as Sahukar Pet. Sahukar basically means a money lender. And today it's called Saukar Pet. This is where you find the Gujaratis, the Marwadis, the Jains, the Telugu Chettis, the Tamil Chettiars. They all operated from that one long stretch called Saukarpet Mint Street. And even today, when you go there, you can very easily identify by the temples and the buildings as to which quarter was occupied by the Gujaratis, which quarter was occupied by the Jains, which quarter was the Marwadi, Hindu Marwadis, and then which by the Chettis. So you can see there is a clear gradation of areas leading all the way up to the mint, which stands at the end of that particular street. So the Nidhis came to Madras in a big way sometime in the 1850s, when people realized that if they went to a money lender, they were essentially going to lose whatever they had. So it was far better to form a cooperative and put money into it, lend the money on interest to people at decent rates of interest, not at exorbitant rates of interest. And at the end of the tenure of the fund, you distribute the profits to everybody. So the first such nidhi, in fact, nidhi formed, documented nidhi formed in the history of India is what is called the Sadar Nidhi. The Sadar was basically the court meant to sort out Indian cases as opposed to the English cases. So the Indians had a Sadar court which was in Alvarpet, where Ambujamal Street and Sriman Srinivasa Iyengar Road intersect today. And that is where the Sadar court was. So the employees of the Sadar court get together and form Nidhi. And this is in 1858. And the rule is that everybody who forms a part of the Nidhi will pay 1 rupee every month for 84 months. And people who needed money could borrow money from the Nidhi at 6.25% interest per annum. And at the end of 84 months, everybody who had paid 1 rupee would get 102.5 rupees as their return. So this was the return on investment as far as this particular nidhi was concerned. It was not in the sense that it at the end of 84 months it would close and it would liquidate itself. It would enter into voluntary liquidation. So this is how it started. But once you had the success of a nidhi, other nidhis started coming up, which is how you find that the city of Madras is full of historic nidhis like the Porshavakkam Benefit Fund, and then of course some names that came to infamy and grief like the Roypeta Benefit Fund, the Egmore Benefit Fund. Then you had names like the Chetpet Shashwata Nidhi, which exists even today. The Mylapore Hindu Permanent Fund, whose building I've put up over here as an example, one of the oldest the funds in Mylapore and still going strong. And at the beginning of a ring a bell to mark the beginning of transaction. At the end of 8 hours, they will ring another bell to mark the closure of transaction. Even today, they ring that bell. And you can see the bell when you're walking up and down South Mada Street. So these are all the historic nidhis. And so the idea of a nidhi, or what we would probably recognize as an NBFC, or at a much lower level, a chit fund, all of that really starts in this particular era when the permanent funds began coming. I mentioned to you about the arrival of the Jains, and Agarchan Manmal Saukar, that is his portrait that I have put up over here. The A.M. Jain College and all that is named after him. He's one of the earliest Jains to come into the city sometime in the mid 1850s. And they were carrying on lending money in the traditional way, which is, pawnbroking. Essentially, you pledge your security and then you take money from them. So this is how this was going on. As I said, the British banks that were formed in Madras and then they collapsed, some amalgamated. But in 1843, you had one of the banks that had a very long record in this city. That was the Bank of Madras. It was formed as to represent British interests. And Srivats in his introduction mentioned the Madras Chamber of Commerce. Essentially, the British companies that were members of the Madras Chamber of Commerce, they were the people who really funded the beginning of the Bank of Madras. It was meant to be their bank. And since Srivats is here, I must also mention that the Bank of Madras looked down on all Indian businesses. And in the words of T.T. Krishnamachari, its essential reason for its existence was to support the British business houses and emasculate any Indian who wanted to start a business of his own by denying him any deposits. So, for instance, the TVS group, of which Srivats is a member, till the time that the Bank of Madras, which later became the Imperial Bank and then was taken over and then became the State Bank of India, nationalized in the 1950s, TVS group began in the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken. Till they could never ever hope to banking facilities with the Bank of Madras. It was denied to them because that was the idea, that you did not lend money to an Indian. So this was the Bank of Madras, one of the most powerful at that time. And along with the Bank of Calcutta and the Bank of Bombay, these were the three great presidency banks. And they had the power to issue currency locally. So you had Bank of Madras notes, which was the currency for Madras presidency. And there was even an exchange rate between the Bank of Madras's currency and the Bank of Bombay and the Bank of Calcutta. This continued till the 1920s when Bank of Madras, Bank of Bombay, and Bank of Calcutta merged, and they became the Imperial Bank of, which in the 1950s finally becomes the State Bank of India. So this was the most important bank in the beginning from the 1840s. The Chettiars were carrying on their own banking system in parallel in a place called Coral Merchant Street in Georgetown. And what is very interesting is from the 1870s, you find lots migrating to places like Burma, Malaysia to begin trade because the English interests were moving there. And many of the British business ventures were actually bankrolled by the Chettiars. So they went there along with the British, they supplied the finances, then the British would acquire rubber estates, drilling, which went on in Burma. All of that was essentially started off with Chettiar money. So the Chettiars, as they spread all over and they went almost all the way up to Vietnam, they needed to know what was going to be the exchange rate at any given point of time. That exchange rate would be finalized in this building in Coral Merchant Street, which even today exists. This is a chatram belonging to the Natukote Nagarathas. And here, every Tuesday, the elders of the community would meet and they would finalize the exchange rate, and that would be transmitted by telegraph all the way down the line. And that is how the Chettiars operated till the 1930s when the Great Depression came, when they suddenly realized that it was every man to himself and they mandate. But for a good 50 years, the exchange rate was actually monitored from Madras city for interest rates, not exchange rates. Interest rates were actually monitored from this nondescript building in Coral Merchant Street in Georgetown. Now, everything was going fine. The Bank of Madras was not going to give money to the Indians under any circumstance. Indians were also very happy just being clerks, working for the British business houses, becoming kumastas to the British lawyers. Some of them were, of course, making a fortune as lawyers themselves by this time. And then in 1906, one of the most unthinkable developments took place. You know, at that time, you had Binney, you had Parry, and you had Arbuthnot and Company. Arbuthnot and Company was really the biggest among all British business houses of Madras. They had interests, you name it, and they had interests in it. And they were also running a bank which was called the Arbuthnot Bank. And this was their headquarters on First Line Beach or Rajaji Salem. In 1906, on October 22nd, Arbuthnot insolvency. A day before that, Patrick McFadden, who was the controlling partner living in England, he threw himself in front of a running train at the Victoria station and killed himself. And next day, the papers, the signs were put up outside Arbuthnot and Company in Madras that the bank had gone insolvent. Thousands of families were ruined in the process. Everybody who was somebody in Madras presidency had invested in Arbuthnot Bank. Several of the money lending Chettiars and the Brahmins of Kalide Kurchi, they all had hundi facilities with the Bank of Arbuthnot's Bank. So their liquidity as well was affected. So this was probably the first mega banking crisis that Madras presidency and Madras city had to face. Even the governor of Madras became insolvent, Sir Arthur Lawley. He had invested money in this particular bank. British business interests, including the MadrasChamber of Commerce, they were very keen that they should protect the directors of Arbuthnot and Company because they were one of us British. They had all studied with us, they had done business with us, and the big effort now prevent the directors from being brought to trial. But by the time you had top-ranking Indian lawyers in Madras, you also had judges. The judiciary also had Indian judges, and so you had Sir S. Subramania Iyer as the judge who sat on this particular case. V. Krishnaswamy was the lawyer who argued on behalf of the investors and finally ensured that justice took place. The director, Sir George Gough Arbuthnot, was sentenced to 2 years rigorous imprisonment and then he left for England. The assets of Arbuthnot and Company were brought into liquidation. This was in 1906, and that is when the Indians, led by V. Krishnaswamy Iyer, Raja Sir Annamalai, and others, begin to ask, if a British bank can fail, why can't we start a bank of our own? And that is how a new bank is started. And because it was begun by Indians, it becomes the Indian Bank. So the Indian Bank begins in 1906 on the ashes of Arbuthnot and Company. Eventually, it would buy the headquarters of Arbuthnot and Company, which is why in this particular photograph, you see up there is a Union Jack, and down below it says Indian Bank Buildings. This was Arbuthnot Building, which was acquired by Indian Bank sometime in the 1920s or so. Later, the Indian Bank had the offices and Beach, this building was demolished and that building was put up in its place. Indian Bank still stands on the foundation of Arbuthnot Bank. So this was in 1906, and 1906 is a very historic year in the history of India because in 1905, Curzon had partitioned Bengal, and the whole of the country was, rising in protest, and there was this Swadeshi movement. People were beginning to realize why should they support British investments? Why can't Indians take charge of their own future? Why can't they form industries of their own and things like that? So the Indian Bank is often upheld as an instance of the Swadeshi Bank. At the same time, insurance company being started in Madras in the same year, and that was United India Insurance, begun by a man called by the Lingam brothers, of whom nothing. But the mainstay was the manager Vijendra Rao, and he starts off and he makes United India Insurance a success, but he dies very early. After which the MCTM family comes to take over United India Insurance, and they take it to great heights before nationalization really happens. It's also in 1906 that Indians realized that they could, if the Indian Bank was a commercial bank, they decided they could get into cooperative banking. Legislation has already happened in Madras Presidency that you could get into, people could form cooperative banks in their own regions to lend money to artisans, to weavers, to farmers, and so on at very reasonable rates of interest. And Madras city gets the first cooperative bank in the history of India. In 1906, Urban Cooperative Bank is formed with Sir V.C. Desikacharya, the great lawyer, as its chairman, and others, participating in it. Eventually, by the 1920s, this would become the apex bank for all the cooperatives in Madras Presidency. Post independence, it would become the Tamil Nadu State Apex Cooperative Bank. And even today, it stands in the intersection of Bose Road and Rajaji Saleh. The building is there, and it is one of the larger cooperative apex cooperative banks in the whole country. It definitely was the first. But today, if places like Maharashtra and others have so many cooperative banks, it was the example that was started here. The Madras State Cooperative Bank was the beginning, and then its success is what encouraged other regions to form their own cooperative banks and take it forward. So this is one of those early instances where the first idea to form an Indian bank comes from here. The first idea to form a cooperative bank comes from here. It's fascinating to see how many developments took place over here. I spoke to you about how the MCTM family carried United India Insurance to great heights. They would then start life insurance as well under United India and general insurance. Finally, MCT Chidambaram Chettiar in the 1950s would embark on building the LIC building that we all recognize on Mount Road. He was killed in an air crash in Singapore when he was just 52 or 53. And subsequently, of course, as we all, insurance came to be nationalized, and then this became part of the LIC, which is the name that we know of it. But it is a standing testimony to not only their business skills, but also to the success of a insurance company in Madras. And it is also interesting to note that much of the city's area developments actually happened because of the local insurance companies. So you have a Prithvi Avenue in South Chennai. That was essentially the assets of the Prithvi Insurance Company. Most of these insurance companies, they would invest their money in real estate development because that meant security. And so Prithvi Avenue comes up like that. United India Colony comes up because of United India Insurance. So that is how these areas would all develop in the city. The Madras Stock Exchange, not a story, shall I put it, because it starts in 1937 with several stockbrokers, but never ever really manages to reach the levels of what the Bombay Stock Exchange is ever going to reach. And finally, in the when SEBI comes in much later, so and brings in very strict norms about what should be the net worth of a stock exchange if it needs to survive, and what should be the annual turnover in terms of business. The Madras Stock Exchange is fallen far short of all that, and finally it's closed. It doesn't exist any longer. So, but it is a development that needs to be noted that the city did have a stock exchange of its own. In 1937, the very same MCTM family that took United India Insurance to great success starts the Indian Overseas Bank. This was essentially to fund investments in overseas locations. The Chettiars, that was their hate. They did not know that the Second World War was coming 2 years later. And with that, that Chettiar world in Burma and Malaysia would all collapse and they would all have to come back. Even now, the name continues Indian Overseas Bank because that was the original intent with which it was set up. That if Indian Bank was meant for investments within the country, Indian Overseas Bank was meant for Indians investing in business opportunities abroad. So that is the secret behind the name. The Society of Auditors. It's very interesting to note that it is an older body than the Chartered Accountants, Institute of Chartered Accountants. It was started, I think, if I am not mistaken, sometime in 32. And so it is India's oldest professional body for accountants. And it was begun in Madras. And the first woman chartered accountant is also from, and that was R. Sivabogam Ammal, whose photograph I put up over here. A freedom fighter who went to prison in late 1920s, early 1930s, had a dream that when she came out, she should qualify in accountancy. So writes the government diploma for accountancy examination, which was the equivalent of the CA at that time, and qualifies. The government denies her her professional certificate, saying that if you want to be in a professional career, you could not have gone to prison. Shivabogam Ammal sues the government, takes it to court, wins the case, and becomes accountant. And even today, there is a Shivabogam Ammal Prize given to the women candidates in the southern chapter of the Institute of Chartered Accountants who come in accountancy, I think that is the paper. So this was also a very interesting sidelight. Now we've continued all the way. We've come to independence. I should now begin by saying that in the late 1920s, you had what was known as the Great Depression, and it was the first major that would globally affect practically every country, and India was no exception to that. At this time in the United States, General Motors began a hire purchase scheme. They started what was to facilitate people for buying vehicles and trucks. You could pay back on installments on an EMI. The hire purchase scheme began. In 1939, Anantaramakrishnan introduces it in Madras with Simpson Motor General, with a company that provides Simpsons and Motor Finance Corporation, with which vehicle purchase is funded. But the man who would really take it and to very great heights was T.S. Santanam of the TVS family. Santanam, it was very characteristic of Santanam that he never took any credit for it. He always said that this idea was not mine. It was idea given by TVS in various places. So when he went on his marketing journeys, truck operators would tell him that as a TVS group, you sell everything. You sell spares, you sell vehicles, it's all wonderful. But you are not into two things. One is you are not into insurance of vehicles, and you are not into financing of vehicle purchase. So he first begins insurance, which later becomes Madras General Insurance, later nationalized, taken over by the government. And he also begins Sundaram Finance Limited in 1954. The certainly one of India's most largest and one of India's most respected NBFCs still today, but was far beyond that of simply being a finance company. The writ of ran to the extent of modifying India's road policy, India's policy as far as lending money was concerned. In every way, Santanam was hugely involved. And I must also tell you that he fought a lifelong battle against every state has a border check post, and every town practically has a border check post, and there are excise rates and tolls at every section, all of which went to affect the road transport industry in a big. He was a champion of road transport because Sundaram Finance was essentially into the funding of the purchases of lorries and buses for a very long time before it got on to other things and became the Sundaram Finance Group. But the interesting thing is that the government was always for the protection of railway interests against road interests. And they felt that if road transport was to be opened up and made uniform right across the country, railways would fail in comparison, which is why they gave free run to cargo on railways, but they placed blocks at every level possible to road transport. Finally, it's only with GST coming in that many of those controls have really begun to vanish. And Mr. Santanam is sadly not around to see that. But I'm sure wherever he is, he must have rejoiced at this development after having spent a long life fighting for it. But this is the first minutes of Sundaram Finance Limited, which is why I put it up over here. With Sundaram Finance 50s, one would think that more number of companies would follow suit. But what happened in the 1950s is also that industrial houses of Tamil Nadu and particular Madras found their attention being taken up by in an entirely different direction, and that was manufacturing. I think the fundamental Tamil culture is that you are always a little about making money out of money. There has to be something very tangible like manufacturing, which is all considered to be better than trading and making money on the stock exchange and stuff like that. But on the other hand, a place like Bombay, even a lift boy will be looking at the stock market every day in the morning and wondering how he's going to make money on it. In Tamil Nadu, the very thought process was very different, and you find that even a traditional group like the Murgapas time had been, business overseas. The moment they came back and they decided that this was going to be their base, and in fact, they are the ones who really pioneer industrialization in a big way in Madras because of starting of the TI cycles and that entire group of companies in Ambattur. That is really the first. After which many other companies get into manufacture. Of course, amalgamations was running parallel to it. Then you had the Ranes, you had TVS, you had several others coming in. But even the Murugapas, for instance, they get back into France only in 1978 with Cholamandalam. Till that time, they are entirely focused on manufacturing a good 2 to 3 decades. And that you find is very interesting that except for Mr. Santanam and probably R. Tyagarajan and a few others who are going to come up in the wake of that, most others were focusing on manufacturing as their business. And even if they were into financing of some kind, that money was essentially being channelized into manufacturing. In a way, Madras city hugely because it became a manufacturing base. As I never tire of saying, if we produce 3 cars every minute and one vehicle every 90 seconds, and if 33% of India's auto components come from here, it's because of all these pioneers who, with their sweat and toil, laid the foundation for an industrial base over here. But we did not consider the financial industry to be a very great opening, or we consider it to be a lesser priority. Let me put it that way. Something that was very different in Bombay. But the ideas never ceased coming. So in the 1980s, today, of course, this is not a great name, but in the 1980s, the first leasing company, the very first company to encourage leasing in India was, as the name suggests, First Leasing Company of India Limited. That brought in the concept of leasing, and today, and later, not today, I mean, at that time, Hyderabad would hijack this idea, lock, stock, and barrel. And you found I think on one particular day in Hyderabad, 14 leasing companies were registered at the same time or some such thing. And they all collapsed roughly at the same time. So, the interesting thing is that the Chennai, the ones that pioneered leasing, many of them may have vanished, but the solid financial companies that got into leasing, they remained in leasing, they exited from leasing, but they kept their name very, very clean and continued. doing what they felt was their core business. At one time, they saw an opportunity, they came into it, then they left. But it is very interesting to see that the idea for leasing really starts from here, and it's in Madras city, but the way it's spread all over is remarkable. The story of NBFCs is not a very story, especially of the later NBFCs. The reason why I put this slide up is this is a typical headline that you see of a certain set of NBFCs that came up in the 1980s. Many of them were funded through very strange means. Some of them came from the sale of liquor. Some of them came from capitation fee from engineering colleges and other colleges that they were running. And that money was being brought into finance. Many of them thought that they could borrow money forever from banks and other institutions. So they did not have the solid depositor base that some of the older companies had. But they certainly had a very successful run for almost 10 years in this city. And so when the finance, we can't overlook the story of these NBFCs and the way they all collapsed, leaving several people ruined, just like the Arbuthnot Bank at one time. And it is the same human nature. Arbuthnot Bank was offering more interest than anybody else, so everybody was going and investing. Did they think that this was a charitable business? Even now, when you ask people about why did you go and invest in this NBFC that collapsed, they'll say, he was willing to give me 14% interest, 15% interest. And you ask for you to imagine that a financial institution would give you 15 to 16% interest. They were blinded at that point of time. And they decided to put their money in it, and they lost all their money. But some of the big fallouts have actually happened in our city. There's no denying that. If we thought leasing came from here, don't forget that the first mutual fund of India also came from here. That was Kothari Pioneer, which later became Franklin Templeton. And so in 1993, when mutual funds began, it was a Chennai company that really leads the process and gets into mutual funds. Of course, other centers have made it much bigger, but we do have a good base of mutual fund companies over here as well. And there's no denying that, we've been in that business for. Last slide is to just give you an indication of, see, I told you many stories of many pioneering ideas. The first joint stock company, the first, arbitrage on interest, which the Dubashas were doing at that time. And then we talk about the first Indian bank. We talk about several things. Then, the first leasing company, the first mutual fund. Somehow, what we have always been known for is a solid backend. We are very good at systems and procedures. And probably that is what really matters when it comes to finance, which is why perhaps so many South Indians, Tamilians take to chartered accountancy and do very well in it as well. They have a certain flair for systems and procedures. And probably nothing indicates that better than the success of CAMS as a company, which came in to provide what its founder, Shankar, very modestly would always say, janitorial services for the mutual funds. But it is not janitorial services. Can you imagine an entire network of mutual funds operating all over the country, depending on a backbone which is sitting over here and really providing the spine on which the network is working all across the country? It sometimes boggles the mind. Similarly, when the World Bank moved its entire back office operations to this city, you somehow felt that this was the ideal location because the idea of fly-by-night operation, making a quicksilver profit, is really not something that the Tamil or the Chennai psyche is very comfortable with. When we get into a business, we are here for a long haul. When we get into it, we want to respect systems and procedures and make what we feel is a decent and a respectable profit at the end of the day to keep the shareholders happy. In that way, I would say that, we have probably scored far better than many other locations when it comes to the financial services we offer. We may not be glamorous, but we are very solid and we are very respectable. On that note, I will conclude my presentation. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much, Sriram, for the brilliant presentation and walking us through the finance history of the Madras, including the rise and fall of Arbuthnot, the first chairman of the Madras Chamber.
Yeah.
And the chamber, which is half as old as the city itself, is very happy to have these kind of discussions. And even today, as Srivat's mentioned, we are working on this, probably reviving the city as a film city. And you have proved us right. Thank you so much. We have some questions. Can we take that? We have some questions in the Q&A box.
Certainly. I think it's in the
Should
chat.
I read it out for you, Sriram, or would you like to take it?
You were mentioning that the Nawab had been borrowing huge sums of money. What exactly was he was leading a extravagant lifestyle, shall I put it? He had a number of dependents, all of whom needed to be kept happy, and the money was going towards that. It was wealth without responsibility. He was a very good man. The Nawab was a very charitable man. He did a lot of charity, but the he was not financially wise, shall I put it that way? And that is how that is how things really happened. So was Arbuthnot failure triggered by the collapse of the gold digging enterprise in the Wayanad region? Certainly, that was one of the biggest reasons for the collapse. There was a foolish belief that there was gold available in and you just had to go there. And Arbuthnot invested. In fact, Arbuthnot invested in any foolish scheme possible at that time. So there was a belief that there was gold available in the Nilgiri mountains. So they invested there as well. They put their money in any scheme that was bound to fail. It was amazing that there could have been so much of speculation going on with innocent investors' money. But it's not any different from any modern collapse. You take a look at it happened in recent times as well. I don't have to mention any names. You find that things haven't changed. From the late 20s to the early 40s, very good question. Film financiers ruled the roost, very colorful as well. Was it a deliberate omission? In the sense that yes and no, and till the 60s and 70s, when other kinds of money began coming in. But the reason was I found that much of the money was actually Andhra money. There was very little, there was a Chettiar money going into it, but a lot of it was Andhra money because people from the rice belt in particular, a lot of cash and they were coming here to invest in films. And that was one reason. Secondly, I could not get any organized data to give me any idea as to what was the quantum of money that was being invested, who invested. I couldn't get anything, which is why I decided to leave it out. I think that's it, Saraswati. I didn't find anything else.
In the Q&A, there are some.
Where?
Yeah.
Under the chat, there's Q&A. So there are questions there.
Yeah. When did Mumbai overtake Chennai and become a commercial capital is one question.
You're muted, Sriram.
Sriram?
One second.
Yeah.
Am I still muted?
No, you are audible now.
So when did Bombay overtake Madras as a commercial? Right in the 1860s, when Civil War happened, and cotton supply from the United States to Manchester and that area, what is it, Manchester and Lancashire, had to be expanded to make up for the gap. And Bombay became the leading supplier of cotton. The cotton was largely in Andhra, but there was a better railway service going towards Bombay and not a very good one coming to Madras. So the money was all going there, and you found the Parsis in particular became multimillionaires overnight. And like Sir Jamsetji Gigi Boy, Sir Jahangir Khawasji Ready Money, all the Chand Roy Chand who built the Bombay University Tower. These were all people who, and Bombay just overtook every other Indian city to become the financial capital. It was also blessed by the fact that it had a natural harbor and Gujarati enterprise, Parsi enterprise. So, I think that helped quite a bit. It became what the British were very fond of saying as Urbs Prima in Indis. That is the first city of India. Calcutta was the second largest city of the empire. Madras was known as the benefited presidency. It was also known as the Cinderella of all presidencies, which the Madras Chamber of Commerce gave the name. They said that no money ever comes over here from the central government, and so we are always given the last leftovers after Bombay and Calcutta have taken away everything. So we were known as the Cinderella among all cities. What is there, Saraswati? Where are the...
No, some are in the Q&A. I'm reading out from Q&A now, not from the chat box, under the chat. Was Chennai the original name? Then why it was called
okay.
Madras
Then
at the early days?
was Madras ever a center for jewelry? In the sense that it was like everything else. Yeah, I got that. I see it over here. What can be, one is was Madras ever a center for jewelry finance? It was like any other traditional Indian city, a center. You can't say that it was that people came to. Jewelry finance went, it was there because it was very much in the Indian psyche long before the colonials came. So it just continued that way. What can we learn from history to shape the financial sea of the future? I wish I had an answer for that. I really don't know. Good question. Like we have regulations in place now through RBI. Was there any such regulation then with a common yardstick across banks? No, certainly not. Not till the formation of the Reserve Bank of India. We have regulations. You had banking committees. There was a finance committee under the Viceroy, but it was all very, very crony capitalistic. It depended upon whom you knew and how you could run your institution based on that. Regulations, as we know of it, let's not forget that stock market regulations have come as late as the 1990s into our country. So banking regulations too came very late in our history.
Would the panelists want to ask anything? Mr. Ram Kumar or any of our people in the panel, would you like to check with him on anything?
Sriram, there are a couple of other questions that I'll just take you through.
Please.
One of it was when you were talking about the Dubashis. Were there any instances of the Dubashis being caught out and prosecuted?
Yes, very much. Avadhanam Papaya, in Pursavakkam, he was dealing in forged bonds concerning the Nawab. And it was that usual state story, one Dubash falling out with another Dubash and then turning a whistleblower. So there was a guy called Raya Reddy Rao who was one Dubash and Avadhanam Papaya was the other. And they both went on trial and finally Raya Reddy Rao committed suicide and Avadhanam Papaya was exonerated at the end of the day. But there were Dubashes who stood trial for several misdemeanors. In fact, Dubashes were kind of synonymous with misdemeanors for a very long time, at least till 1857 or so. After which they became commission agents and the system became very transparent and they couldn't do much. But they made money, but they made it out of ethical means.
Incidentally, I was just Googling and there's actually a bank called Arbuthnot Latham.
In England, even today, yes. Very much.
Yeah. It was founded in 1833, apparently.
Correct. It is the English equivalent of the Arbuthnot Bank over here. They were a very powerful family, and that company survived the whole crash. And you remember there was also an engineering company called Arbuthnot over here for a very long time. They used to be involved in construction of all the factory buildings and all that. That was also a fallout of Arbuthnot and Company.
Srivats, would you like to say anything before we conclude?
I think it's absolutely a fascinating story about Chennai, and I'm a convert. I think when the city's name was changed from Madras to Chennai, I continued to use Madras for the longest time, till such time that we started traveling so much by air that Chennai was kind of built into our psyche by virtue of the online ticket code. So I found it very fascinating to hear about the story of how everything from the Dubashes to Arbuthnot, and also a little bit about how some of the early enterprises started in the city. And I think that we are all proud to be part of the heritage of the city, and hopefully, as a chamber, we should remember our past and hopefully allow it to guide us into the future. Thank you, Sriram, once again for excellent presentation, and we will reach out to you to have conversations outside of this setting.
Anytime. Thank
In
you.
fact,
Sriram.
since many of
Wow.
them couldn't log in, we also shared it in the YouTube. So quite a number of people have seen it through the YouTube also, and I'll share the recording. So
Sure.
thank you so much. We could not have had a better session on the eve of the Madras Day. So
Sure.
let us all be proud about Number Chennai, and this is through Number Chamber. Thank you.
Just WhatsApp the YouTube link to me because somebody has sent a message.
Oh,
So if you can just
Sure.
WhatsApp the YouTube link, I'll share it with them also.
we'll do it immediately, Sri.
Thanks, Sachin. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
so much.
Bye, everybody. Bye, Ramkumar. See you.
Thanks.
See you.
Good to see you too. Bye.
Bye.